Hi, today I'm going to read Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice was a loud place indeed. You could hear it 100 miles away. That's a long way. Can you see him reading his book? For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. That's a long way. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in his bed in his bedroom in his house, which is at the top of the hill. That looks like where Peppa Pig lives. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, Mr. Noisy's snore was... when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It's going to be loud, isn't it? It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling! Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, where he lived, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Can you see what time it is on the clock? It's 7 o'clock. The big hand is on the 12, and the little hand is on the 7. 7 o'clock. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying above wobbled. Oh dear. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, 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 clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang it went as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf of bread. She was a little bit scared of his booming voice, noisy voice. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher's. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him the meat. He was a bit scared. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, said Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb as she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down in Wobbletown. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, said Mr. Noisy. Sorry, what did you say? She said. Can you speak up a bit, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Oh dear. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop, the butcher's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, said Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said, I'd like a piece of meat, said Mr. Noisy, roaring very loudly. Pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up. He went out, went home, went to bed. He was very hungry. The next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "Oh, what?" said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice, "A loaf of—" And then he stopped, and then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly," she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop, the butcher's shop. "I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did," shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—" And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please," said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Oh dear, the poor little worm looks very sad because his boots are very noisy. Then he stopped, and then he thought, and do you know what he did? He tiptoed. Tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never ever done. Can you see him on his toes? It was fun. You could try it at home too. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door and then went to stop. And then he thought, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly, gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before. That was fun too. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. Can you see everyone looks happier now, don't they? Even the little worm. The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learnt to whisper. I wonder if you can see if you can learn something new to do too. That's brilliant. Thank you for listening. Bye.